It was impossible for Germany to win the war, but it required very grave mistakes to lose it. Holger Afflerbach, November 1918. The mighty German Empire, which had once thundered into war with the most powerful army in the world, now lay fractured not by foreign occupation, but by something far more dangerous: disillusionment. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to exile. Soldiers mutinied in their ports. Revolution spread like wildfire from the trenches to the cities. And across the battle-scarred plains of Europe, the Central Powers collapsed, one after another. But here lies the enigma. Less than a year before, Germany had been winning. Russia had fallen. Eastern Europe was carved open like a prize. And in the West, German troops were pouring toward Paris in a last titanic gamble that for a time seemed it might even succeed. So how did it all come undone? How did a nation that had outmaneuvered Russia, that had nearly broken the Western Front, that pioneered modern warfare, find itself not just defeated, but in revolutionary ruin? To answer this, we must unspool the war not just through maps and numbers, but through the choices made and not made in Berlin. For history does not reward strength. It rewards judgment. And judgment, in the case of Germany's high command, would prove the rarest currency of all. The German Empire entered the Great War in August 1914, guided by a military doctrine shaped by prestige, precision, and preemption. Its core strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, was designed to knock France out of the war quickly by sweeping through neutral Belgium and encircling Paris, before wheeling east to confront the lumbering Russian colossus. But from the beginning, this plan, brilliant in its boldness, collided with a series of brutal truths. First, the Belgian resistance was far tougher than expected. Second, the logistics of rapid maneuver over such distances proved impossible to sustain. And third, most critically, the French did not collapse. At the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, French and British troops counterattacked. The German advance ground to a halt, and the quick war turned into the horror of trench warfare. As Prussian General Helmuth von Moltke the Elder had warned years before, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Germany now faced a two-front war. And worse, it had dragged Britain into the conflict by violating Belgian neutrality, a gamble that would haunt Berlin to the very end. The war Germany had prepared for short, decisive. Continental became one it could not afford to fight. Long, global, industrial. Still, for the next 3 years, Germany held its own. And in the East, it did far more than that. By 1915, German forces, often coordinating with Austro-Hungarian units, had smashed Russian armies and captured entire regions of modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics. In 1917, they watched as Russia collapsed altogether, first into revolution, then civil war, then surrender. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in early 1918, confirmed what many in Berlin believed. The gamble had worked after all. Germany now controlled the East, had knocked a major adversary out of the war, and could shift dozens of divisions to the Western Front. With the clock ticking before American troops arrived in force, Berlin made one final epic push. Operation Michael, launched on the 21st of March, 1918. 70 divisions, 6,500 guns, 75,000 prisoners taken in the opening blows. It was the most dynamic offensive since 1914. But then, the advance stalled. And the Germans once again faced the same grim reality. Superior tactics do not win wars on their own. If the story of Germany in World War I has a theme, it is this: a relentless pursuit of risk, driven by fear, by overconfidence, and by a refusal to confront political limits. The military elite General Erich Ludendorff, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, and others repeatedly pushed for maximalist war aims: control of Belgium, parts of France, the Baltics, even Ukraine. They rejected compromise peace. They dismissed political dissent. And above all, they treated war as a matter of will, not strategy. Even after the catastrophic Battle of Verdun in 1916, a pointless slaughter that drained German manpower, the High Command refused to adjust course. As historian Holger Afflerbach observed, Germany did not just lack the power to win, it lacked the flexibility to avoid losing. In 1917, the desperation deepened. Berlin resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to starve Britain into surrender before the United States could intervene. The result? America joined the war instead, bringing with it industrial might, manpower, and morale. Germany had won in the East, but it had woken the industrial giant of the West. By spring 1918, the German High Command knew the window was closing. America was mobilizing. The Allies were learning. The home front was cracking. So Ludendorff gambled everything on one last offensive, a rolling series of hammer blows from March to July designed to crush Allied resistance before the tide turned for good. Each of these blows, Operation Michael, Georgette, Blücher, Gneisenau, Friedensturm, made gains. But each also exhausted German resources further, scattering their tactical brilliance across the front like shrapnel. By the Black Day of the German Army, the 8th of August, 1918, it was clear. The stormtrooper tactics had reached their limit. The reserves were gone. The Allies under the unified command of General Ferdinand Foch were now coordinated, modernized, and relentless. And in the rear, something darker was stirring. Not just defeat, but collapse. The belief is prevalent among officers and men that Germany cannot now win the war. British intelligence report, Etusene a 918. In the trenches of northern France, the spring of 1918 had offered German troops something they had not felt in years: movement. No more mud, no more stalemate, but breakthrough, hope. For weeks they advanced. And then, without warning, the push stopped. Orders shifted. Objectives changed. Supply wagons didn't arrive. The promised victory dissolved in confusion, and men began to ask, what now? The answer, increasingly, was silence. The German army, still tactically effective, still filled with brave and determined men, had simply reached its breaking point. Casualties were astronomical. From March through July, Germany suffered nearly 1 million casualties, and unlike earlier in the war, these were often from the elite units, including the new stormtrooper formations that had been trained for breakthrough operations. And replacements were nowhere near enough. Germany required 200,000 fresh men per month to sustain its lines, but each month brought only 70,000 wounded returning to the front and 25,000 new recruits. The army's total strength fell from 5.1 million in March to 4 million by September. And what the Allies could not destroy by fire, they unraveled by hope. Because by summer, the arrival of nearly 2 million American troops had shifted the psychological balance. Even if American combat experience was limited, their presence meant something. Germany would not win. And when men lose belief, they do not fight the same way. In the summer and fall of 1918, the German army began to fracture not from mutiny, but from demoralization. Entire units surrendered without orders. Others advanced into Allied lines only to stop and loot captured supplies instead of fighting on. Some German troops, starving, broken, exhausted, began attacking their own supply trains just to find food. Military intelligence in Britain noticed the change. Prisoner interrogations revealed a growing theme. It doesn't matter to us if we end up German or French. We just want it to end. One soldier, Frederick Meisel, wrote of the horror. I reached for my gas mask, then noticed to my horror that a splinter had gone through it, leaving a large hole. I felt like an animal cornered by hunters. I leapt at a wounded man and ripped his gas mask from his face. The last thing I saw before putting on the mask were his pleading eyes. Desertion became routine. Up to 180,000 soldiers disappeared on their way to or from the front. Surrenders once seen as shameful began to accelerate. In the final 3 months of the war, nearly 400,000 German troops surrendered. That number was close to the entire number of French soldiers who had surrendered during the first 4 years of war. Why? Because these were no longer men defending a national cause. They were men trapped in a war whose logic had broken down. The elite commanders had promised victory, then confessed it was lost. The generals had demanded sacrifice, but now blamed the troops for weakening. And as morale collapsed at the front, revolution erupted at home. Part 6. Collapse in Berlin. A war without a political plan. By October 1918, it was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose, but how quickly. The German Empire, always a military-first state, had failed to build a political path to peace, and the cost of that failure came due. In the Navy, crews mutinied rather than embark on a suicidal final voyage against the British fleet. In factories, strikes flared up as food rations collapsed and inflation soared. In the cities, people began openly denouncing the Kaiser, calling for Republican rule. Even as the German army fought on the borders, the state itself was crumbling from within. Chancellor Georg von Hertling warned the generals of unrest. General Ludendorff's response, "More repression is required." But repression could not feed hungry families, nor replace faith in a cause that no longer inspired sacrifice. The empire had no message left, only commands. And so, when Austria-Hungary collapsed, when Bulgaria surrendered, and when American divisions pushed deeper into France, Ludendorff panicked. In early October, he finally told the Kaiser, "The war is lost. We must ask for an armistice." But it was too late. In early November, the revolution reached Berlin. Wilhelm II abdicated, fleeing into exile. A provisional Republican government was formed. And on the 11th of November, 1918, at the 11th hour, the guns fell silent. But the wound did not, because in the years that followed, German elites and right-wing nationalists would claim they had not been defeated in battle, but betrayed from within. A poisonous lit, and one that would prepare the ground for the next war. The German army, for all its virtuosity, was let down by a failure of generalship. David Stevenson. The guns of August had given way to the silence of November. But even as the armistice was signed, the seeds of denial took root. Rather than confronting their own mistakes, the misjudged offensives, the failed diplomacy, the refusal to seek peace while they held the upper hand, many in the German elite constructed a narrative of betrayal. They called it the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. According to this fiction, Germany's armies had never been beaten. They had stood undefeated in the field until revolutionaries, communists, Jews, social democrats had undermined them from behind. It was a myth, a comforting one, a dangerous one, because the truth was far more damning. Germany had lost because its leaders, military and civilian alike, had failed to adapt. They had insisted on victory long after it was possible. They had silenced dissent, repressed protests, and gambled over and over again with their people's lives. And the army? It had fought with incredible tenacity, but it had also collapsed not from cowardice, but from exhaustion, hunger, and a war whose aims no longer made sense. When troops surrendered in droves, they were not traitors. They were men who had been asked to give everything and were told nothing in return. Germany's military was among the most innovative of the war. They pioneered stormtrooper tactics, precision artillery coordination, chemical warfare, and the logistics of a total war economy. But innovation alone did not make up for structural flaws. The High Command, from 1916 onward, ran the country like a dictatorship. But Ludendorff and Hindenburg were strategists, not statesmen. They had no plan for political resolution, no peace policy, no economic strategy beyond continued sacrifice. Their decisions reflected a kind of tunnel vision. Each crisis met with escalation, each failure blamed on someone else. Even when it became clear, in late 1916, that the Allies could not be defeated in the West, the generals pushed for more battles, Verdun, the Somme, and then the great offensives of 1918. By then, Austria-Hungary was falling apart. Bulgaria was isolated. Even the Ottoman Empire, once propped up by German officers and arms, was cracking under pressure. But rather than adjust, the German military clung to annexationist war aims, permanent control of Belgium, occupation of Luxembourg, and economic domination of Eastern Europe through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They believed, even as their people starved, that these dreams could still be realized. They could not. And what's more, the lands Germany conquered in the East, especially Ukraine, proved useless in practice. German troops were tied down in occupation. The promised food and grain never materialized. Resistance grew. Supply lines were overstretched. Berlin had won on paper but lost in reality. Part 9. The Allies imperfect, but learning. The Entente powers Britain, France, and later the United States made grave errors of their own. The French had nearly cracked in 1917. The British had suffered horrifying casualties on the Somme and at Passchendaele. Russia had collapsed under the weight of internal division and imperial mismanagement. But unlike Germany, the Allies learned. They coordinated their war aims. They placed General Foch in command. They pooled resources. And, crucially, they listened to the pressures of their own societies. Strikes were negotiated, not crushed. Propaganda was aimed at unity, not just obedience. And with President Wilson, however flawed, came a message of democratic renewal that helped bind the war effort together. Militarily, the Allies caught up. They mass-produced tanks, aircraft, trucks, and artillery at an industrial scale. In 1918 alone, the French produced 50% more aircraft than Germany. The British fielded hundreds of tanks. American factories began to ship vast quantities of material and supplies to the front. The war was no longer about front lines. It was about systems, and the German system was collapsing. Part 10. A Republic from the Ashes. By the time the Weimar Republic was proclaimed in November 1918, the German Empire had disintegrated. The monarchy was gone, the army disillusioned. The people, starving and humiliated, wanted peace. But that peace would prove fragile, because the real failure of 1918 was not just military. It was a failure of vision. Germany had waged a war of ambition without strategy, violence without negotiation, and sacrifice without accountability. And when defeat came, the architects of that failure did not take responsibility. They fled. They lied. They blamed. Ludendorff, who had presided over the disasters of 1918, would later claim Germany had never truly lost, that the Republic was born in shame. Ali, but one that would find an eager audience. Empires fall not by enemies, but by erosion from within. Legacy Files Reflection. The Germany of 1919 was not merely a nation defeated. It was a nation adrift. The abdication of the Kaiser left a vacuum. The High Command, which had wielded near absolute power in the war's final years, abandoned responsibility and transferred the burden of surrender to civilian hands. The armistice was signed not by generals, but by politicians, men like Matthias Erzberger, who would be assassinated 3 years later by nationalist extremists for his role in ending the war. The peace that followed the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties, loss of territory, limits on military strength, and enormous reparations. But what hurt most was the narrative. Because while the treaty carved away provinces and wealth, it also carved away the possibility of truth. The stab-in-the-back myth, promoted by the same military elites who had orchestrated the disaster, hardened into ideology. Millions of Germans came to believe they had been robbed of victory by traitors, Jews, socialists, and pacifists. It was this belief, not Versailles alone, that would lead Germany toward the next war. Because myths, once forged, do not fade. They become weapons. Part 12. A Final Reflection. The Empire that Destroyed Itself. Germany in 1914 had the most advanced army in the world. It had industrial power, scientific prowess, and a corps of officers trained in the traditions of Clausewitz and Moltke. It had allies, victories, innovations, It had momentous opportunities to seek peace, to adjust strategy, to balance ambition with realism. And yet, it chose none of these. Instead, the German Empire placed its trust in risk, in military will, in autocratic command unchecked by political oversight. It refused compromise. It rejected diplomacy. It punished dissent. And when the end came, it tried to erase its own hand from history. Suppose we were to take Paris. Would that mean peace? Philipp Scheidemann, 1918. Even in victory, the German leadership saw no political goal, only a map filled with redrawn borders and occupied peoples. No vision, no reconciliation, just dominance. And so, Germany did not simply lose the First World War. It destroyed itself. Part 13. An unfinished story. There is one final irony. In 1918, the Allies stopped short of invading Germany. They signed an armistice. They believed peace could be rebuilt from within. That democracy, the newborn Weimar Republic, could stabilize the ruins of empire. But by allowing the myth of military invincibility to fester, they unknowingly left the door open to something worse. By 1945, they would not make that mistake again. The Allies crossed the Rhine. The Red Army entered Berlin. There would be no ambiguity, no debate. Germany would be defeated, totally and undeniably. Because the war that began in 1914 did not truly end in 1918, it ended with the ruins of a second catastrophe, a war born not from strength, but from the refusal to reckon with weakness. And so the question remains, what if Germany, in 1916, or even 1917, had taken the off-ramp? What if its generals had told the truth? What if its leaders had made peace? Would the 20th century look the same? We'll never know. But we do know this. History does not forgive recklessness disguised as strength, nor blindness wrapped in ambition.